Hi, this is Emerald and welcome to the Diamond Net, and today I'm going to be talking to you about coping mechanisms. Alright, so before I get any further into the topic, I want to go ahead and define what a coping mechanism is. So basically a coping mechanism is a set of actions, beliefs, or a general MO in life that help a person deal with a suboptimal situation, and these can be either psychological coping mechanisms, emotional coping mechanisms, or even physical coping mechanisms. Now in my video, I'm going to be focusing mostly on psychological and emotional coping mechanisms, but I'm going to go ahead and give an analogy to a physical coping mechanism to show you kind of how it works. Alright, so a suboptimal physical situation that might cause a person to need to use a physical coping mechanism would be if somebody breaks their leg. So if somebody breaks their leg, they can do a number of things. So they can ride in a wheelchair, they can use crutches, they could hold on to a banister, they can hop on one leg. So all of these are different types of coping mechanisms. Now if you notice, not all of these coping mechanisms are equal. Some of them are a lot easier to go through life with, whereas other ones are really not the best thing for coping in that situation, and some might even be harmful. So again, if we go back to our broken leg example, if you decide to hop on one leg all the time and you're putting so much pressure on that other leg could also get hurt as well. Psychological and emotional coping mechanisms work in a very similar way. Now the mind is a very complex thing, so when we use psychological coping mechanisms, it's often that these psychological coping mechanisms will kind of interfere with other psychological processes. So sometimes psychological coping mechanisms can work at cross purposes to normal psychological activity, or they can even bump into other psychological coping mechanisms, and this will create complexes where we'll end up with issues that have a lot of different facets and a lot of different complexities to them that are very difficult to untie. Almost like if you have a bunch of necklaces all tangled up together and you have to actually go in there and pick the whole thing apart. Also, if we've repressed certain aspects of ourselves, then other aspects will have to work harder to compensate for those aspects of ourselves that aren't coming to the table. Also, if we've experienced trauma in the past, we might develop certain mindsets or beliefs or habits to avoid experiencing those traumas again. This is also an example of a coping mechanism. So psychological coping mechanisms are a lot like crutches in that you're trying to compensate for some issue that you're experiencing to be able to function normally. So for example, if somebody has experienced a trauma that's made them feel unlovable, or if they haven't had a certain need met for validation and love, they might go seeking validation on social media, posting all the time. That would be an example of a coping mechanism. Or if someone has a baseline sense of inferiority, they might become a workaholic and become extra, extra, extra good at doing what they do. That way they can convince themselves that they're not inferior after all. So that's why inferiority complex and superiority complex kind of go hand in hand. Now I want to make sure that I'm clear on this next point, is that coping mechanisms are for coping, they are not for healing. So coping mechanisms are always suboptimal to actually healing, just like using a pair of crutches would be suboptimal to actually having your broken leg mended. Now, like I said before, not all coping mechanisms are equal. Some coping mechanisms are relatively healthy, and some of them are very unhealthy. So for example, if you have a broken leg, a healthy coping mechanism would be using a wheelchair or using crutches. An unhealthy coping mechanism would be just to ignore the leg and pretend like it's not broken and continue walking on it anyway. Now, if we use a physical example like this, it seems pretty absurd that anyone would try to walk around on a broken leg. But at the same time, we oftentimes have a lot of psychological and emotional coping mechanisms that are the equivalent of walking around on a broken leg. So if we want to get rid of our unhealthy coping mechanisms, we either have to find a way to heal, or probably more realistically from that place, find a healthier coping mechanism. But the end goal of everything should not be to cope for your entire life. Coping is absolutely necessary for dealing with various psychological traumas, but the ultimate end goal should be to actually heal. And the process for healing is called reintegration. Now, to explain what reintegration is, I have to first describe what disintegration is. So as we go through life, we experience different events, we adopt certain beliefs, we might even experience traumas. And through all of that learning and through all of that experiencing, we come across things that we don't want to have associated with ourselves, or we think are dangerous to our well-being. And so those aspects that we've considered unacceptable, or things that we just don't want to look at, things that we'd rather ignore, we take those things and we relegate them to the unconscious. So they kind of hang out in what Carl Jung called the shadow. Now, oftentimes when we think about repression, we usually focus on it in relation to trauma, which is a big source of repression, probably the biggest source. But there's a lot of little decisions that we make throughout our lives that aren't necessarily trauma-based. We just kind of make a decision that something isn't true that actually is true of ourselves. And we decide, I would rather not look at that, so I relegate it to my shadow. Like, for example, when I was in the 9th grade, I really enjoyed kind of punk rock music. But then when I was in the 10th grade, emo came out, and I really didn't like emo, and punk was too similar to that. So I decided arbitrarily that I did not like punk rock music anymore, when actually, I think I really actually did, and see, this is why it's difficult to know exactly what's true of yourself, because if you're so used to thinking about things in a certain way, we might not even recognize what's true. And so we systematically create a resistance and a habit of resisting these aspects of our reality, these aspects of ourselves. So the reason why I say it's systematic and habitual is that it has to be constantly going on. Otherwise, it would just buoy right back up to the surface, because the way the psyche is designed is it's naturally designed to bring you into a state of equilibrium where everything is reintegrated. So you have to have basically these coping mechanisms, these habitual habits of keeping down those aspects of yourself or ignoring them. So this is why coping mechanisms can be quite pernicious. They help you cope in the world, and they help you feel like you have a sense of who you are and how things are. Very good protecting mechanisms, but they're also the thing that keeps you from reintegration. And basically, reintegration is where we see a trait or aspect of reality, and we see it as a valid part of ourself or a valid part of reality, and we just allow it into our experience. We might like it, we might dislike it, but we say, hey, that is an aspect of reality, and this is part of me, and so I'm going to accept it. Now, there's a huge relationship between disintegration, coping mechanisms, and ego. Likewise, there's a huge association with egolessness, reintegration, and a lack of need for coping mechanisms. So what the ego is it's basically like this huge collection of thoughts, and really a thought process for maintaining the illusion of a separate self. So the idea that you are this person with these interests that generally does these things and likes these things and does those things over here. Like, it's all of these concepts about yourself all stacked together. Now, the ego is just a thought process that you yourself created. Your self-concept is something that you've actively had to create, just based on decisions you've made throughout the day as to how you are and who you are and what you like and what you don't like. But this illusory identification with this complex string of thought processes called the ego, and believing that it is yourself, it makes it feel like that big glump of thought processes actually needs protection in the same way that your physical body needs protection. But instead of putting on a suit of armor externally to protect the body, we've kind of put on a suit of armor to protect ourselves from things that we deem as harmful, or things that might undermine our self-concept or our identification with our self-concept. So this is where coping mechanisms come into play, and all of these mindsets that are meant to keep certain aspects of ourself ignored and relegated to the shadow. So whenever a person transcends the ego, or completely dissolves the illusion of ego and completely disidentifies, what happens is that there's a sense that, oh, that huge collection of thought processes and thoughts that I've been identifying with, that's been an illusion. It's not real. It doesn't need any protection at all. So once the ego is gone, the shadow becomes obsolete too, because we no longer need to edit anything out of our experience. That we realize that nothing psychologically and nothing in our internal experience can actually hurt that ego, because the ego isn't real. And so what I had experienced in the past when I had my experiences of ego transcendence is like immediately things that I had been ignoring for many years just kind of came bubbling up to the surface of my awareness. Things that I hadn't looked at in years and years and years that I scarcely remembered were there. But yet they were so familiar and they carried with them a certain sense of wisdom. And in that state of wholeness, like I had no fear and I had no suffering. And so I also didn't need to cope with anything. So without the blockage of ego and all of the coping mechanisms that it creates, if you remove that, all of those traits, all of those aspects of reality, and all of those emotions that were previously ignored and repressed and in the unconscious come to the surface. And almost in the same way that if you have a buoy that's weighed down, like, and you have it pushed way, way down under the water by many different anchors and weights, and then you just remove the anchors from it, it just naturally comes rising up to the water's surface. That's how those traits come to be reintegrated when there's no ego there. You know, and I was very, very surprised to find what was there in my unconscious, because it was at once very familiar, and deep down I always knew those things were there. But I really didn't consciously know it in the years previous, because my mind wouldn't go there, my mind wouldn't allow them in, you know, because I had so many coping mechanisms and so big of an ego that it just wouldn't allow anything to rise to the surface of my consciousness. And whenever you get back in touch with those traits that were previously repressed, you have to understand those traits carry a link to wisdom with them. And so there was this sense that, oh, I've always known everything I've ever needed to know. It's always been right here in my experience. So the more integrated you are, the more wise you are, because you have a deeper access to wisdom. So this is why egolessness, reintegration, and expansion of consciousness go hand in hand. But understand that by no means do you need to transcend the ego to actually reintegrate your traits. All you have to do is be very, very honest with yourself and actually go through the process of shadow work, which I also have a video on if you want to check it out. That said, a person who hasn't transcended or dissolved the ego will always need to have coping mechanisms to get by. Because it's the ego that creates the need for a shadow and creates the need for repression, then they're always going to have to be in place to help a person function day to day, living in the illusion of ego. So having said everything that I've said, coping mechanisms are valid. Coping mechanisms are not a bad thing. They're just not ideal. Think of coping mechanisms as kind of a method for symptom management, like taking an over-the-counter medication or something to sort of alleviate the symptoms of your illness so that you can go about your day and actually get things done. Whereas integration is like taking antibiotics or something like that, that actually attacks the illness at its root and gets rid of it. So even in light of your knowledge about coping mechanisms and how they sustain the illusion of ego, do not make an enemy of coping mechanisms. Now, coping mechanisms can be unhealthy sometimes. Sometimes we come up with really unhealthy ones, but you have to understand that the intention that your mind has in creating a coping mechanism is a very positive one. Your mind will often put coping mechanisms in place on the subconscious level that are meant to be used for your benefit, even if it ends up being incredibly detrimental. However, if we recognize that we have an unhealthy coping mechanism, like drinking alcohol all the time or doing drugs to escape the pain of reality, these type of things, we would need to actually switch our coping mechanisms out. We need to get rid of the unhealthy coping mechanism and put a healthy coping mechanism in its place, or at least healthier. And a huge word of caution that I can give you from personal experience with coping mechanisms is to hold on to your coping mechanisms until they're actually not useful to you anymore. Because chances are, if you can still get use out of them, then you probably need them. So think of a coping mechanism as being like walking around on crutches. chances are if you're walking around on crutches, there's a reason why you're walking around on crutches. So don't say, oh, these crutches are just coping mechanisms and try to kick them out from under yourself. That's going to end in disaster. Now, it's important that whenever you identify any coping mechanisms that you might have, to sort of separate them practically into 3 different groups. Like you have positive coping mechanisms, and you have negative coping mechanisms that cause you problems in life, and then you have neutral coping mechanisms. So the thing to know about positive coping mechanisms is they generally help you get ahead in life, but at the same time, these can be the most difficult ones to let go because society smiles upon these things. So for example, if you've developed a coping mechanism of being a workaholic and having like this ambition and this drive, but that's coping for some really negative things underneath, it can be really, really difficult to let go of that coping mechanism and actually see what's underneath it to try to reintegrate. Now, negative coping mechanisms are things like addictions and other types of detrimental things that are going to cause you problems in life. And these can be difficult to let go of too because of their addictive nature. And then we have like neutral coping mechanisms. These would be things that society generally does not like these because society generally doesn't like to see any kind of displays of emotion or anything that's considered an emotional weakness. But these are like fairly innocuous, many of them. Like for example, like posting on social media all of the time for validation. Like that would be an example of a neutral coping mechanism. It doesn't really cause anything positive in your life or negative, other than people will kind of roll their eyes at you. Now, what I would recommend with regard to neutral coping mechanisms, like if you see somebody else trying to cope in that way, is don't shame them for that. They're doing that for a reason. They're doing that because life is hard for them in some way or another. They're dealing with some kind of issue and they're trying to compensate for it. And if it helps them, then, we should be at least, like closed mouth about it and not be too judgmental. Now, one of my major experiences that led me to come to these conclusions about coping mechanisms and how they can be very necessary, but at the same time are a symptom of ego. So basically, when I was like 16 or so, I started to very much identify with like having a really, really good work ethic and, like trying to be excellent at everything. And there was also this like unconscious idea that, oh, I'm going to be better than other people. And, in that way, I'm going to add value to myself. And so I had really become like a workaholic. And I was absolutely willing to stay up for nights and nights and nights as much as I possibly could with very little sleep just to get everything done. What I didn't know at the time, over the course of 4 years that I really, really had my nose constantly to the grindstone, was that all of this work ethic and all of this willpower and all of these kind of ego building type of activities, were coping mechanisms set in place to compensate for a baseline inferiority that I'd always felt my entire life. Then when I was 20, I had my experiences of ego transcendence. And I no longer felt inferior, not during those experiences. Now afterward, yes, it all came back. But during that time, I felt completely valid, and I didn't need to prop up any sense of worth or validation or anything like that from my work ethic. It just wasn't really necessary. And it was clear to me that there had always been a negative motivation there. And so what I was doing at that moment was I was recognizing the crutches that I was using. And in the experience, I no longer needed them. So while I had transcended the ego, I genuinely no longer needed those crutches. So imagine that prior to that experience, my consciousness level was this big, right? And this is just a metaphor, but imagine that this was all I was conscious of before that experience. And then during that experience, my consciousness opened up to be the size of the universe. But then after the experience of ego transcendence, but when I became re-identified with ego, it went back to about the same size. But I had remembered all of the insights that I had received in that state where I was much more receptive to wisdom. And so because I recognized that all of my work ethic and all of my ambition was negatively motivated, like my thought was, oh, well, those are, that's an awful thing to do. Clearly, I need to, throw off those coping mechanisms that I had been using because I need to actually heal from that problem. In a sense, my need to heal was correct, but I was very incorrect in trying to throw off those coping mechanisms because I still very much needed them. I was still very much at the same level of consciousness than I had been before the experience. I just remembered intellectually that these things were coming from a negative place. And so what happened is, instead of actually transcending those coping mechanisms, what I did was I started to repress those coping mechanisms. So I thought, well, okay, then I'm not going to do my best in school. I'm not going to try hard. I'm not going to try to build my ego up. I'm going to try to break myself down in any way that I can, because I thought that that was what would bring me closer to that state where I was no longer suffering. And of course, this turned out really disastrously. I mean, my grades fell, I was in the middle of college. It was like the least opportunistic time for this to happen. But because I had repressed a healthier coping mechanism, like trying to do well in school, it had to still be met some other way. And so I developed some less healthy coping mechanisms. And one of which was to be, I developed kind of a vanity. And then also, I kind of engaged in some promiscuous behavior because I started to define my worth not based on my merits, but based on my sexuality and my desirability. And I really ended up in a lot of gnarly situations that I wouldn't have otherwise ended up in. So if you kick away a positive coping mechanism, that can lead to you to some very, very negative aspects in life, So don't kick away your crutches. If you're using crutches, you probably need crutches. Just try to get aware as possible as you can of the coping mechanisms that you're using. So don't kick your crutches away until you definitely don't need them anymore. Otherwise, you're going to hurt yourself more. So if your leg is still broken, you still need crutches, and to try to kick them out from under you is only going to make you maybe break that leg more, or maybe break another leg or an arm. So the question here would be how to create healthier coping mechanisms. Now, like I said before, coping mechanisms in all forms are not the ideal thing that you're trying to do. Ideally, you're trying to reintegrate, you're trying to transcend the need for coping mechanisms. However, chances are you're going to need to use tons and tons of coping mechanisms in your life. So you want to be able to create healthy coping mechanisms. So basically, any kind of healthy coping mechanism is going to be a coping mechanism that is going to help you create a simple but strong ego. So a strong ego is one where you can find positive emotions easily, ones where you can create good habits and routines for yourself, ones where you have generally an optimistic outlook on life that, might help you in a situation, So, for example, if you have a weak ego, if you think negatively about yourself or if you think negatively about the world, chances are you're not ever going to be able to transcend a weak ego because you're not going to be able to conjure the willpower and the energy to actually go about the process needed to transcend your ego. But if you have a strong ego, you're going to be able to at least temporarily find that motivation from your sense of self and to be able to move more towards self-mastery. So these are the type of coping mechanisms you want. Ones that are actually going to add something to your life. Ones that are actually going to create a solid infrastructure in your life. That way, if you do happen to transcend the ego at some point in time or become enlightened, then you have this great system that's already in place that you can practically use, that's going to not be super detrimental to your health or your wellness. So the first step in creating healthy coping mechanisms is to first assess yourself and to find out which coping mechanisms that you're actually using. And you want to find out why you're using them as well. So maybe, for example, you have a habit of down-talking yourself in front of others because you want other people to come in and say, no, 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 you're a really wonderful person, you are actually really attractive, you are actually really good at doing things. because you need to be validated in that way. So that would be your coping mechanism would be your saying those things, and your need would be like you want to feel that sense of validation and that positive kind of commentary coming in at you to validate your worth. Or perhaps maybe you have a tendency to gossip a lot about other people, and judge other people for what they're doing. And maybe the reason behind doing that kind of coping mechanism, or like practicing that kind of coping mechanism, would be to actually feel better about yourself in comparison. Maybe you feel inferior a lot of the time, so you judge other people so that you're like, well, at least I'm better than that person, or at least I'm better than that person. And I want to mention that when you do this, you want to be really, really brutally honest. This is not meant as like, oh, look at how much of a terrible person I am for using these coping mechanisms. You have to realize that there's a valid reason why you've adopted the coping mechanisms that you have, and that way you can kind of follow them down to their core. And that will actually help the reintegration process, should you choose to undertake it. The second step is to find healthier ways to have your needs met. So for example, if you feel a sense of baseline inferiority all the time, and that's why you judge other people, clearly judging other people is not a very healthy coping mechanism. So maybe you can find a way to feel better about yourself by actually doing something that you're proud of. Something that you can think very positively about yourself about without having to think negatively about other people. Or there's a lot of times I'll hear like people talk like if they've had addictions, that they'll instead like do something creative as an outlet to feel good, as opposed to trying to sort of like self-medicate and like escape reality that way. The third step is to accept coping mechanisms that are already in their highest form. So if you have a healthy coping mechanism, and again, these are not ideal, so they're only relatively healthy, but if you have one that's benefiting you in some way, leave that one be. Don't try to repress it away, because again, you're going to end up with a less healthy coping mechanism in its place. Or even if it's a neutral one, like fishing for compliments, and that's really honestly the best you can do from where you're at, go ahead and just do that. It doesn't really hurt anybody, and just accept the fact that, hey, I feel like I need to be validated in some way, so I'm fishing for compliments. Only maybe try to do it in a way that's a little bit more honest. That way you're not manipulating other people into getting those compliments. Say, hey, I feel really negatively about myself, so I'm gonna fish you for compliments, and you can create maybe a better way to go about that kind of neutral coping mechanism. Now, step 4 is, of course, to do processes like shadow work so that you can reintegrate. That way you don't need to have these coping mechanisms for your entire life. You can actually transcend them and grow past them. And that's ultimately the goal of the spiritual path, is to be able to live as a whole human being. So it's important to be able to accept all of the traits that we have. And whenever we have everything in our conscious experience that is of us, we have this sense of wholeness, and that's where, and this is specifically why people are seeking enlightenment as well, as to become whole in a sense, because we no longer feel separate from any other aspect of reality, including aspects of reality within ourselves. So with regard to reintegration, number 1 rule, don't kick away your crutches. Just focus on healing and reintegrating as you use your coping mechanisms. It doesn't have to be one way or the other. It's not like you can't reintegrate and use a coping mechanism while you're reintegrating. Think of it as similar to being like physical therapy, where a person's trying to learn how to walk, maybe again with their crutches, and so they're using their crutches to help them along, but the end goal is to not have to use crutches. Also, it's important to realize that awareness itself heals. Like, there are many things that we're unconscious of, and specifically becoming conscious of them and inviting them into our conscious experience wholly and entirely. These are things that actually help us not have to use a coping mechanism. Also, I have a couple of videos on the channel that, might be of help to you. I have one that's titled Jungian Psychology, The Shadow, and then another one that's titled Shadow Work. And this just goes a little bit more into how the shadow actually gets formed and how it works with the shadow video. And then the Shadow Work one talks about how shadow work functions and how to actually reintegrate. But mostly be easy on yourself during this process. This is a pretty long process and it should be taken gradually. You know, you shouldn't try to stretch further beyond your reaches, otherwise you have a huge possibility of hurting yourself accidentally. So always take things gradually, and again, don't kick your crutches out from under you. Please don't. It's awful. It's horrible. Trust me, I know. Alright, that's all I have for you for now. I hope that you enjoyed the video. Thank you for watching. If you haven't subscribed already, go ahead and click the red button and subscribe below. Also, thank you to my patrons for supporting my channel. And until next time, keep becoming more you.